Good morning, colleagues. The 39th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. Before we proceed to consider the items on our agenda for this morning, it is my sad duty to pay tribute to the memory of His Excellency Samuel Rudolph Insinali, President of the 48th session of the General Assembly, who passed away on 26 November 2023. On behalf of the General Assembly, I should like to convey our deepest condolences to the government and people of Guyana and to the bereaved family of Mr. Insinali. I now invite representatives to stand and observe a minute of silence in tribute to the memory of His Excellency Samuel Rudolph Insinali, former President of the General Assembly. Thank you very much. The General Assembly will consider Agenda Item 35, entitled Question of Palestine. Under this item, the Assembly has before it the report of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, circulated in document A/78/35, and a note by the Secretary General circulated in document A/78/303. The President will now deliver a statement from the rostrum. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the question of Palestine has lingered on the General Assembly's agenda for 76 years. Over the decades, numerous resolutions have been adopted, instruments established, and international law invoked to end the vicious cycle of violence in the Middle East. Yet politics have again grown froth, and the loss of civilian life agonizingly rife, as unfortunately we all are witnessing in recent weeks. The horrifyingly lethal attacks by Hamas on 7th October has deepened the divisions, while Israel's response in placing Gaza under siege has only hastened the urgency to achieve a peaceful and just solution to the situation in the region for a secure and better future for the peoples of the region, in which Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace and security within internationally agreed borders. The longer the fear, distrust, appetite for revenge, hatred, and anxiety fester and deepen further, the more lethal the psychological chasm grows, and the darker the shadow it will cast over generations to come. One could be forgiven for asking, where does this end? Excellencies, it is time to acknowledge that the divisions we perpetuate in this hall are deeply connected to the hopelessness that millions will inevitably feel outside these walls. Should we continue to fail in finding common ground, to engage with each other respectfully and in good faith, and to gain traction towards better outcomes? Sustained security and stability in the Middle East cannot and will not be achieved without a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace. The only viable way to break the endless cycle of conflict, violence, and mutual pain and suffering is through a two-state solution in line with the relevant United Nations General Assembly resolutions. Just as the Assembly agreed in 1947 to collectively address this issue, it must now take seriously and uphold its responsibility to support the two sides to peacefully resolve this conflict. This means working much harder to build the consensus needed for peace. It means forging new avenues for direct dialogue between the parties, fostering respect for General Assembly resolutions, and supporting all efforts that build on previous agreements. We must therefore do our utmost to seek all viable outcomes for the sake of the many innocent civilians who have paid and currently are paying the ultimate price of our continued failure to unify. At all costs, we must do our part to avert any regional conflagration. Distinguished delegates, in this context, I welcome the opportunity of the temporary ceasefire that allowed for the release of hostages over the weekend and access to much-needed humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza and all affected areas. I share the deep relief this must bring to the affected and their families. This agreement offered a breakthrough for hope, but it is not nearly enough. I strongly call, yet again, for the humane treatment and immediate unconditional release of all hostages. I reiterate my call for a longer-term humanitarian ceasefire so food, water, and desperately needed medical aid can reach all those in need in the Gaza Strip and all affected areas. Humanitarian aid corridors must remain open and secure, and more assistance simply must be allowed to enter Gaza and all affected areas. I strongly condemn the indiscriminate damage caused to UNRWA schools that are now housing more than 1 million internally displaced persons. It is unthinkable that in the prosecution of this war, contrary to the rules of war, schools are no longer inviolable, nor are they used exclusively for their intended purpose, that is, education. Under international law, the protection of civilians is and must remain paramount. I therefore urge member states to provide sustainable and predictable support to UNRWA as it works to rebuild and valiantly address the biggest humanitarian crisis since its establishment. And I reiterate my solemn tribute to all brave UNRWA staff and other humanitarian workers who gave their lives trying to attenuate massive human suffering in the search for lasting peace. Excellencies, amid this carnage and extraordinary loss and sacrifice, we must find our way back to rebuild trust. Trust that the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings are born free and equal, that all deserve a life free from fear and want, and not written in vain. Trust that the UN Charter and international law, the pillars of our multilateral system and the foundation for our efforts to chart a more peaceful tomorrow, remain intact. Trust that parents and relatives on both sides of this conflict throughout the Middle East will be able to put their children to bed each night in safety. I repeat, in safety. Ralph Bunche, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950 for his work as a UN mediator, had similar aspirations when he expressed his hope for morality in the relations among nations. I reiterate in his words that there be in our time, at long last, a world at peace in which we, the people, may for once begin to make full use of the great good that is in us, unquote. As President of the General Assembly, I remain at your service should any nation or leader desire my assistance in facilitating dialogue towards this end. I thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency Ahmad Faisal Mohammed of Malaysia in his capacity as Vice Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People to introduce the committee's report.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, allow me first to thank esteemed delegations for their dedication to the question of Palestine and for their support on the 27th October General Assembly vote on humanitarian assistance to Gaza and the resounding General Assembly vote on UNRWA resolutions. The committee also welcomes the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2712/2023 concerning the Gaza Strip and demands all parties to comply with its implementation and their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, most notably with regard to the protection of civilians. It is an honor in my capacity as rapporteur of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People to present the annual report of the committee contained in document A/78/35. The report covers developments relating to the question of Palestine, as well as the work of the committee between 2nd September 2022 to 31st August 2023. The report is organized in 7 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 contain the introduction to the report and a brief overview of the major political developments during the reporting period. The referenced developments served as the context for the committee's evolving work program and activities during the reporting period. Chapters 3 and 4 outline the mandate entrusted to the committee by the General Assembly and contain information on the organization of the committee's work during the year. Chapter 5 features the work of the committee as well as the activities carried out on its behalf by the Division of Palestinian Rights around 4 major aspects of its mandate. 1, mobilization of the diplomatic community. 2, raising awareness on the question of Palestine. 3, cooperation with intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, and UN entities. And 4, capacity building. Chapter 6 reports on the activities of the Special Information Program of the Department of Global Communications on the question of Palestine. The last and final Chapter 7 of the report contains recommendations of the committee to this Assembly and other relevant actors, which are based on the international consensus and the Secretary General's known position on the question of Palestine. Specifically, the committee calls on Israel to halt and reverse its ongoing annexation, home demolitions, settlement expansions, and the forced displacement of Palestinians, including women and children. The committee urges Israel to reverse punitive measures against the Palestinian Authority, cease the disproportionate use of lethal force, and protect Palestinian civilians, including from Israeli settlers, in line with its obligations under relevant UN resolutions and international humanitarian law. The committee calls on Israel to respect the status quo at the holy sites in Jerusalem, ensure peaceful religious practices, and lift the ongoing land, air, and sea blockade of Gaza. The committee deems unilateral decisions taken by member states to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel as null and void, and urges member states to officially recognize the state of Palestine in order to promote the two-state solution. The committee will continue to encourage all supporters of the two-state solution to assist with the resumption of meaningful multilateral negotiations towards the achievement of a peaceful settlement on the basis of the long-standing international parameters for a just solution. The committee urges the General Assembly and the Security Council to ensure the implementation of the long-standing parameters for peace in accordance with relevant UN resolutions and calls on the Secretary General to continue to leverage his good offices in support of a political horizon and the two-state solution. The committee urges regional organizations to take a politically active role to put an end to the Israeli occupation and to achieve a just and lasting resolution to the question of Palestine, such as the one offered by the Arab Peace Initiative. In a similar vein, the committee urges member states to review anti-terror legislation affecting Palestinian civil society organizations. The committee urges member states to support UNRWA with sustainable funding and calls on them to carefully review Israel's use of anti-terror legislation against Palestinian civil society organizations with a view to delegitimize and undermine their activities. The committee conveys its gratitude to the Division for Palestinian Rights of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs for its support for the committee's work. It requests the division to continue to provide substantive and secretariat support for all aspects of its mandate. The committee requests the continuation of the Special Information Program on the question of Palestine of the Department of Global Communications, which has made an important contribution to informing the media and the public. Excellencies, tomorrow we will observe the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people in the ECOSOC chamber from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. At 1 p.m., the committee will inaugurate the exhibition entitled Palestine, a Land with a People, in the visitors' lobby. We invite all member states to attend tomorrow's events and to submit messages of solidarity from their respective heads of state and governments. This year, in particular, the Solidarity Day observance, mandated by this body and in such tragic times when humanity is tested, presents an opportunity to renew our commitment to protect the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people and salvage the two-state solution. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Next on my list is the Permanent Observer of the State of Palestine.
Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to renew our gratitude to the United Nations Committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people under the leadership of Senegal and Ambassador Sheikh Niang, and its bureau members, Cuba, Indonesia, Malaysia, Nicaragua, and Namibia, for remaining at the forefront of the international community's efforts address the plight of the Palestinian people to enable the realization of their inalienable rights, including to self-determination and freedom, and to bring an end to the grave and historic injustice they have borne for over 75 years since the start of the Nakba, an ongoing and searing Nakba that we have painfully witnessed in the dark days of these past weeks and across the decades. We are grateful to Ambassador Ahmad Faisal Mohammed, Vice Chair, for presenting the committee's annual report to the General Assembly, reflecting on the committee's many efforts over the past year and its appeals to the international community as we gather once again in this assembly to address the question of Palestine, to take stock of where we are today and where we are going, as the United Nations carries forth in its permanent responsibility towards the question of Palestine until it is justly resolved in all its aspects in accordance with international law and the relevant UN resolutions. Mr. President, the UN Charter starts with this line: we, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I often repeat this line in many of my statements. Not a single Palestinian generation has been saved from the scourge of war. Every single one has witnessed and endured horrors in its flesh. An entire nation, over decades, has faced dispossession, displacement, denial of rights, destruction, and death. Maybe since the 1948 generation, this generation is the one that has suffered most painfully and traumatically. This is the deadliest period ever endured by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and they have witnessed many previous assaults. This is the largest forced displacement of Palestinians since the Nakba. This destruction is apocalyptic and the humanitarian crisis catastrophic. There are no laws, no morals, no principles in this world that can justify this abhorrent, inhumane reality. It is one that shakes humans' conscience and demands global action for justice. Mr. President, the massacres against our people in Gaza have mobilized peoples and nations all around the world, speaking out against injustice and calling for justice, calling for a ceasefire now in Gaza. I repeat, calling for a ceasefire now in Gaza, calling for an end to the Israeli occupation and oppression of the Palestinian people, calling for a free Palestine. The General Assembly was the first UN body to reflect this global outrage and to take a clear and unequivocal stance for calling for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. I must add, the Secretary General called for a humanitarian ceasefire now, and the President of the General Assembly a few minutes ago in his statement repeated the same idea. The Assembly convened in an emergency special session and took this courageous step over 1 month ago. 2/3 of the UN membership voted in favor of this resolution. Had it been implemented then, thousands of Palestinian lives would have been spared and families would not have endured such agony and anguish. In adopting this resolution, the General Assembly was guided by the imperatives of legality, morality, and humanity, and it proved also to be correct politically. It took the Security Council several more deadly and devastating weeks to finally act on a less ambitious resolution, but driven by several of the same humanitarian considerations addressed by the General Assembly. As the Assembly's resolution had foreseen, only a truce could allow sincere efforts to begin to address the humanitarian catastrophe being inflicted by Israel, the occupying power, in Gaza. Only a truce could lead to the release of people held in captivity and avoid further regional escalation. This truce must turn into a permanent ceasefire. The massacres of Palestinian children, women, and men cannot resume, should not resume. You should not allow it to resume. The human conscience cannot bear it. International law, including humanitarian and human rights law, prohibits it. International law, but also the norms of humanity, demand that we act to stop this war against innocent civilians and save human lives, that we act for humanitarian aid and access throughout the Gaza Strip, the return of those displaced without delay, the end of the siege and blockade, and that we act for accountability. Nothing can ever justify war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Mr. President, as more and more images of the devastation in Gaza reaches the world, each one of us has a choice to make, either for protection of civilians or their slaughter, either for the rule of international law or indiscriminate vengeance, either for the prospect of peace or perpetual conflict. Virtually every nation represented here has decided, some sooner other than later, to join the right side of history. Now we need to stand united in putting an end to this madness and charting a way forward for a more just, peaceful, stable future. Mr. President, 15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including more than 6,000 children and 4,000 women. More than 30,000 people have been wounded, with many suffering amputations and burns, enduring their injuries and pain without medical care and with nowhere safe to heal and recover. Over 1.8 million civilians in Gaza, or nearly 80% of the population, are estimated to be internally displaced. The majority of them refugees, displaced for the second, third, or fourth times in their lives. Of them, nearly 1.1 million are sheltering in 156 UNRWA facilities across Gaza, bearing indignities that no human should be forced to bear, and still not protected even under the UN flag. Even that is not respected by the occupying power, as it deliberately strikes at homes, schools, hospitals, and UN shelters with barbaric and punitive violence, intent on destroying the basis of human life in Gaza, intent on terrorizing and traumatizing everyone. The sheer magnitude of the killing and maiming, of the destruction and forced displacement, is testimony to how indiscriminate this war is, and goes to show that its primary targets and victims are actually the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. No conflict in recent memory has seen so many children killed at this pace, civilians killed at this pace, journalists killed at this pace, UN staff killed at this pace, humanitarian and medical personnel killed at this pace. This is a full-fledged war against Palestine and its people. This is reconfirmed by what we are witnessing in the West Bank, with over 230 Palestinians killed and thousands have been injured in the span of 7 weeks at the hands of Israeli occupation forces and settlers. Added to the more than 180 Palestinians killed prior to October, in total, among them, 107 children. This is the deadliest period virtually ever witnessed in the West Bank. Over 1,200 Palestinians have been displaced over the same 7 weeks period, added to the more than 1,000 forcibly displaced earlier this year, as Israel carries on non-stop with its illegal settlement, colonization, and annexation of our land. More than 3,000 Palestinian civilians, including children, have been arrested and detained by incessant military raids by the Israeli occupying forces across the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, in the same 7 weeks period, now bringing the number of prisoners to over 10,000 Palestinians held captive in Israeli jails, enduring inhumane conditions. The oppression and persecution, abuse and discrimination against our people continues unabated under this illegal Israeli colonial occupation and apartheid regime. It is the same logic at play everywhere. For the Israeli government, the priority is not security. It is the destruction of the Palestinian nation, of the very presence and existence of the Palestinian people on their land of Palestinian statehood. Even at the expense of security, through dispossession, displacement, denial of rights, and if all that is not enough, then through death, even their right to life is denied. You know how we know all this? Because Israeli leaders cannot get themselves to hide it anymore. They are telling you this every day, in every statement they make. In the words of one of them, Palestinians have three choices, and this one is a minister sitting in the cabinet of Prime Minister Netanyahu. The choices are surrender and subjugation, exodus, or death. Three choices: surrender and subjugation, exodus, or death. And we reject these things because we are proud people and we are determined to live in our national homeland. Mr. President, this catastrophe demonstrated two things: that there is no peace in the Middle East without a just and lasting solution to the question of Palestine, in accordance with international law and the relevant UN resolutions, and that Palestinian freedom, not further oppression and occupation, is the path to peace and security for all. Palestinian rights cannot continue to be subordinated, violated, or erased. They are inalienable, just like for all peoples. The right to self-determination, the right of our refugees to return, the right to life, the right to exist in dignity and peace and stability in our homeland, Palestine. Palestine cannot remain the exception to the rule of law and the enjoyment of human rights. All our efforts must be dedicated now to prevent further massacres and to ending the assault on the lives and existence of the Palestinian nation. But we must, in parallel, be preparing for an unprecedented, bold, and collective effort to end colonization and occupation and apartheid and to achieve peace. The two-state solution requires a strong, independent, and sovereign Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Those who favor such a solution must take action against the colonial occupation that prevents and kills such a prospect and must recognize the state of Palestine, provide it with membership at the UN, and help it actualize its sovereignty on the ground. You have to act now. We have to become like you, a full member in the United Nations, to begin the process of the actualization of the two-state solution after we end the occupation. It is your collective responsibility to allow us to accomplish that. We have stated before in this August Assembly, and must reiterate, Palestine is the answer. Justice in Palestine would mean that our international law-based order has triumphed over impunity and double standards. Justice in Palestine would mean that freedom, peaceful settlement, and coexistence have triumphed over oppression and discrimination. Justice in Palestine means we have upheld the principle that we are equals as human beings and as nations. Let us continue to work together to achieve that justice and to achieve the peace and security that the Palestinian and Israeli peoples, that our region and that the world needs. Help us to accomplish that. I thank you, Mr. President, and once again express my thanks to all members of the committee and to the Division for Palestinian Rights and to all states who continue to offer their principled support and solidarity to the Palestinian people in our ongoing journey to justly and peacefully resolve the Palestine question. And I thank you very much.
I should like to thank the observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. Next on my list is Her Excellency Retno Lestari Priyansari Marsudi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. You have the floor, ma'am.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mr. President, on 26 October, I had stood at this hall to attend the emergency special session where Indonesia co-sponsored the resolution on the Gaza crisis. I have flown back to New York City, back to this rostrum, because I care about justice, because I care about humanity and about Palestine. I cannot stand still to see thousands of deaths of innocent women and children. I cannot stand still to see homes, schools, and hospitals being flattened to rubble. Can you stand still seeing of this horrific situation? On November 11, the Joint Summit of Arab League's OIC issued a strong position on the importance of unhindered humanitarian assistance, permanent ceasefire, and two-state solution. Last week, together with a number of the OIC foreign ministers, I traveled to Beijing, Moscow, London, and Paris. Those countries are permanent members of the Security Councils. I urge them to do more for justice and humanity for Palestine. And I will continue this effort to reach and talk to as many countries as possible. Mr. President, can I ask, is what Israel doing consistent with the international law? Is it consistent with international humanitarian law? Let us be honest to ourselves in answering this question. And if we really want to defend justice and humanity, there are 4 issues we should work for. First, we need a permanent ceasefire. The first extended pause in hostilities is a welcome start to end these atrocities. But these uneasy pauses will not be enough. We need a ceasefire. Without it, it will be difficult to do the rest, to save lives, and for aid agencies to work in Gaza. Second, ensure unhindered humanitarian assistance. Massive humanitarian aid is needed in Gaza. we need to scale up humanitarian assistance. We must support UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies to help 1.7 million Palestinians forcibly displaced in Gaza. Indonesia is committed to scaling up assistance, including by deploying our floating hospital. Third, we must stand for justice. Even wars have rules and limits, and these are nowhere to be seen in Gaza. Attacks against hospitals, schools, places of worship, refugee camps should not be normalized. I repeat, should not be normalized. We must call a spade a spade. What has taken place in Gaza are clear violations of international humanitarian law, and failure to act may equal to complicity. We must also call out double standard in the application of international law, which seriously undermine the sanctity of the law itself. Indonesia therefore supports efforts to ensure accountability of Israel at various relevant forums, including the International Court of Justice. And fourth, restart the Palestine-Israel peace and political process. Mr. President, addressing the question of Palestine requires us to address the root causes, plain and simple. The occupation on the Palestinian land must end. There are no military solution to this conflict. Political solution is the only answer. We need a credible negotiation process that is transparent and equitable, with Palestine and Israel having equal standing as UN full members, leading to a two-state solution based on internationally agreed parameters. Mr. President, Indonesia calls on the global community to stand together with humanity. Only by uniting can we bring peace to Palestine and the region. Only by using our heart can we bring humanity and justice. I thank you very much.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman, speaking on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
سعادة الرئيس
Mr. President, it is my honor to deliver this address on behalf of the GCC countries, which are the United Arab Emirates, the Kingdom of Bahrain, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the State of Qatar, the State of Kuwait, and my country, the Sultanate of Oman. This is in line with the GA's discussion of item 35 on the question of Palestine. I would like to express my sincere appreciation to His Excellency, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and His Excellency, the President of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, for the reports under consideration under the item discussed today. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, our member states call for the end of this indiscriminate attack launched by the Israeli occupation forces against Gaza, targeting civilians and civilian properties, including hospitals, schools, and UN sites. We reject calling this attack as a self-defense. Israel, is an occupying power in line with resolutions of international legitimacy and international law. The countries of the GCC commend Security Council Resolution 2712 issued on the 15th of November 2023, which calls for a mandatory ceasefire to safeguard especially children. We also support the General Assembly resolution issued on the 27th of October 2023, which provided for an immediate ceasefire and access of humanitarian assistance. The GCC countries call for an immediate implementation of these resolutions without precondition, and we categorically reject any attempt at forcibly displacing Palestinians from their territories. In line with the efforts aimed at de-escalation and protecting civilians, as well as ensuring the delivery of humanitarian assistance to our brotherly people in the Strip, we welcome the humanitarian truce reached thanks to the success of the joint mediation of the State of Qatar, as well as the Arab Republic of Egypt and the United States of America, between Israel and the National Resistance Movement, Hamas. We commend this deal. It is of great importance. We also call upon all parties to abide by its terms. We hope that this humanitarian truce would lead to a continuous humanitarian truce that would put an end to the bloodshed and lead to serious talks for a just and comprehensive peace in line with resolutions of international legitimacy. Mr. President, honorable ladies and gentlemen, the countries of the GCC strongly condemn the continuous, heinous crimes committed by Israel against the people, including using the internationally banned weapons. We call upon the international community to hold Israel accountable to such inhumane attacks, which are a clear violation of the international humanitarian law. We reject and deplore any attempt at adding the Israeli settlements to the territories of Israel, which is a violation of relevant international resolutions, including Resolution 2334 of 2016 and the opinion of the ICJ. Also, we condemn the continued settlement building by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories. We call upon the international community to redouble its effort to bring pressure to bear on the Israeli authorities to stop the building of settlements and hold Israel diplomatically, politically, economically accountable for such violations. We also condemn the continued incursions of the Holy Aqsa Mosque by Israeli settlers with the support and protection of the IDF. We believe that such incursions are dangerous violations of international law and the status quo in Jerusalem and its sanctity. It is a violation of the sanctity of Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a provocation of the Muslims all over the world. We would also reiterate our rejection to all Israeli practices aimed at altering the historic and legal status of the Holy Aqsa Mosque or any attempt at its division. We stress that such violations and recurrent attacks against the sanctities would only increase tension and undermine peace effort. It would lead to a cycle of violence. To conclude, the countries of the GCC stress their solidarity and support to the Palestinian people until they gain independence and ensure their self-determination. The occupying power must respond to the calls for peace and participate in serious negotiations with good faith on the basis of the two-state solution. This would bring about peace and stability in this vital region of the world. Thank you, Mr. President.
Next, I now thank the distinguished representative of Oman for his statement speaking on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council and offer the floor to Jamaica speaking on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Mr. President, I do have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean community in contribution to this important debate on Agenda Item 35, the question of Palestine. Mr. President, CARICOM shares the concern of the many member states who are deeply disheartened by the decades-long perpetuation of the Palestinian question. Despite the existence of both a legal and moral framework to resolve the question, it persists to the detriment of both Palestine and Israel. At the outset, therefore, CARICOM underscores that a permanent and just solution to the question of Palestine will both fulfill the Palestinians' right to self-determination and guarantee the security of Israel. Since the last debate on this agenda item, CARICOM has taken note of the developments on the issue and is disturbed that there have been no advances towards implementation of the various UN resolutions on the matter. The situation has instead worsened, and even more so since the events of 7th October. And in considering the events of 7th October, CARICOM emphasizes that violence and hostility will not bring about any lasting solution to the Palestinian question. It has shown instead to stoke fear and mistrust and breed massive suffering and insecurity. CARICOM therefore emphasizes the obligation of all UN member states to be guided by the principles of the Charter in their conduct of international relations. CARICOM also emphasizes member states' obligations to operate in the confines of international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the events of 7th October and the response thereto have led to a massive escalation of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We condemn these events in the strongest terms. CARICOM is appalled by the loss of so many innocent lives, and in such a short span of time. We are particularly appalled that women and children number in the majority of those killed. CARICOM commiserates with the relatives and friends of those who have died under such tragic circumstances, including the more than 100 UN staff members killed in the line of duty. CARICOM is also concerned about the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, which has worsened exponentially since 7th October. The recent truce between Israel and Hamas, including the current pause in the fighting, was an important first step towards the complete cessation of hostilities. We call for a permanent ceasefire. This is critical for delivering life-saving support to the besieged population of the Gaza Strip. It is also critical for setting them on a path to recovery. Mr. President, the international community, including the UN, must seriously contemplate measures for permanently resolving the question of Palestine. As we observed earlier, both the legal and moral framework exist for a permanent solution, but must be matched by the political will. Outside of a permanent solution, Israelis and Palestinians will continue to endure recurring cycles of violence. Further, Palestinians' legitimate aspiration to exercise their right to self-determination will continue to be unjustly delayed. We cannot continue to leave the Palestinian people behind. For its part, CARICOM is open to playing its usual constructive role in taking forward the question of Palestine. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica for his statement on behalf of CARICOM, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of the state of Qatar.
Mr. President, I would like to thank you for holding this meeting. I would also like to thank the chair and members of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Our thanks are also due to the efforts of the Division of Palestinian Rights and the Department of Global Communications Special Information Program on the Palestinian question. We would like to reiterate the state of Qatar's solidarity with the brotherly Palestinian people until they gain their just rights. We associate ourselves to the statement of the GCC. Mr. President, this meeting is held as we are witnessing the worst humanitarian crisis for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip due to the Israeli military aggression on the Strip. It has witnessed violent, indiscriminate shelling against the defenseless Palestinian people, leading to more than 50,000 killed, injured, or lost under the rubble in Gaza. Most of them are from the women and children, which led some UN officials to describe this stripe as children's grave. In this vein, the State of Qatar reiterates its condemnation of the gross international crimes committed by the Israeli occupation against the brotherly people of Palestine. We condemn in the strongest terms the systemic targeting of hospitals, schools, and residential areas in Gaza. This is a heinous violation of international laws and conventions, especially the Fourth Geneva Convention. We reiterate our call to establish an international committee to investigate the crimes committed by the Israeli occupation against civilians in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the State of Qatar renews its strong condemnation of the repeated attacks against the Holy Aqsa Mosque by Israel, the occupying power, as well as the Israeli settlers. We underline that such attacks are considered a flagrant violation of international law, a provocation of Muslims, and any attempt at altering the current historic and legal status of Islamic and Christian sanctities in occupied East Jerusalem, or dividing the Holy Aqsa Mosque temporally and spatially, as well as restricting Muslims' freedom of worship, are all null according to international law and relevant UN resolutions. In this regard, the State of Qatar welcomes the recommendations of the report of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, which calls upon the Israeli occupation to meet its obligations pursuant to international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Mr. President, the State of Qatar stresses once again that the escalation of the Israeli occupation and their continuous attempt at imposing the status quo to water their hands off the entitlements of a comprehensive and just peace will not stop it from its concerted effort to bring about just peace. We will continue to call for a just and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question. This would guarantee the right of the Palestinian people for self-determination and the establishment of an independent state along the lines of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. This would come on the basis of the two-state solution in implementation of resolutions of international legitimacy. This requires an end to the Israeli occupation of all Arab-occupied land, including occupied Syrian Golan and all occupied Lebanese territories. This is the only way to ensure peace and stability in the Middle East. Mr. President, we're holding this meeting following 4 days of a humanitarian truce, thanks to the joint mediation efforts of the State of Qatar, the Arab Republic of Egypt, and the United States of America. This effort culminated in a deal between Israel and Hamas, which started to be implemented last Friday, November the 24th. In line with our continued mediation effort, the State of Qatar announced yesterday that we have reached a deal to extend the humanitarian truce for another 2 days along the previous conditions. The truce deal until today led to the release of 69 civilians captured in Gaza, all from women and children, as well as freeing 150 Palestinian women and children detained in Israeli prisoners. In this vein, the deal also succeeded in ensuring access to the largest number of humanitarian and relief convoys, including fuel for humanitarian needs. To conclude, Mr. President, the State of Qatar stresses that it will continue its diplomatic endeavors to de-escalate, stop the bloodshed, protect civilians, and deliver assistance to those in need. We hope that this humanitarian truce would lead to a sustained and durable ceasefire that would put a stop to the war machine and the bloodshed. It would also pave the way for serious talks on a peace process that would lead to a comprehensive, just, and durable peace deal in line with resolutions of international legitimacy. Thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of the State of Qatar for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of the Maldives.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation extends our appreciation to the Secretary General for his detailed report on the agenda item, Questions of Palestine, documenting the prolonged struggle for Palestinian people. This long-standing issue, marked by Palestinian suffering, demands our urgent attention for a comprehensive and just resolution that considers its complex historical, political, and humanitarian aspects. Mr. President, tomorrow, as we mark the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people this year, my delegation wishes to convey the following message from the newly elected President of the Republic of Maldives, His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Muiz. I quote, "I firmly reassert the unwavering support of the people and the government of Maldives to the people and the government of State of Palestine in their legitimate right for full sovereignty and to live in peace with safety and security." End quote. Mr. President, the Maldives strongly condemns the ongoing brutal occupation and collective punishment of innocent Palestinians, civilians. Indeed, the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict did not start on 7th October 2023. Over many decades, Israel has caused immense humanitarian, social, economic suffering to millions of Palestinians, especially women and children. And as we speak, we are confronted with a dire humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Israeli war against Gaza has led to tragic loss of over 15,000 lives and more than 30,000 people injured. The Israeli Defense Force intentionally targeted civilians, infrastructure including hospitals, schools, and shelters, which has forced many Palestinians to leave their homes. These actions by Israel seriously violate international humanitarian law. Israeli actions in occupied territories must not be exempt from international and humanitarian law or the authority of the Security Council, as well as strong condemnation of this assembly. We firmly believe that the rule of law should be applied equally to all countries, regardless of their size or influence. Those responsible for flagrant violations of international law and international humanitarian law must be held accountable for their actions. Therefore, the Maldives calls on the International Criminal Court to investigate possible war crimes committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. Mr. President, this Assembly reconvened its 10th emergency special session last month, where a landmark resolution was adopted urging resolute action to halt violence against innocent civilians in Palestine. Today, almost a month after the resolution was adopted, we reiterate the resolution's call for an immediate, enduring, and sustainable humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, the provision of essential supplies and medicine, and an end to mass forced displacement in the occupied Palestinian territory. Following adoption of this resolution, we are encouraged by the accelerated actions to find solutions to this crisis. My delegation also welcomes the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2712 on November 15, 2023, which urges immediate and extended humanitarian pause in Gaza and the unconditional release of hostages. We strongly support the Council's call for all parties to uphold their responsibilities under international law, including international humanitarian law, to prioritize the protection of innocent civilians. Mr. President, we commend Qatar's role and other countries in mediating an agreement for an extended humanitarian truce. Now the international community must work tirelessly to implement this truce and ensure a way forward that averts the resumption of this conflict, leading to a permanent ceasefire. Every minute of the truce helped to deliver essential supplies to the millions enduring this humanitarian catastrophe. Every minute of the truce prevents regional spillover and protects the lives of dedicated humanitarian workers. Every minute of the truce helps to release hostages and saves the lives of civilians, particularly women and children. The Maldives commends the efforts of WHO to evacuate 151 critically ill patients and 31 babies in critical conditions from the besieged Al-Shifa hospital. This is just one example that highlights the urgent need for unimpeded humanitarian access. The Maldives joins the international community in paying tribute to the sacrifices of the humanitarian aid workers and personnel, including UNRWA staff, who put their lives on the line to alleviate the suffering of vulnerable population in acutely dangerous conditions. We urge the international community to support UNRWA more robustly. Mr. President, the administration of President Dr. Muiz and the Maldivian people will remain steadfast in supporting the establishment of a free and independent Palestine. We remain steadfast in our unwavering commitment to the Palestinian people in pursuing their inalienable rights, including their rights of self-determination. We call on the international community to continue to urge Israel to end the illegal occupation of Palestine immediately and return the land seized forcefully and stop the illegal settlements, to stop the assaults on lives and dignity of people in Gaza, in the West Bank, and everywhere in the occupied territory, and to recognize Palestine as an independent state with East Jerusalem as its capital with pre-1967 borders. The Maldives reiterates its call for the member states of the United Nations to uphold the UN's Charter, international human rights and humanitarian law, and support the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. We urge the member states to increase efforts to restart the peace processes, seeking a long-term solution where peace reigns. Mr. President, my delegation reiterates our call on UN members to recognize Palestine as an independent state and support its full UN membership. The plight of the Palestinian people should be a global priority, and we urge international community to strengthen its resolve to end the violation of human rights and the suffering of the people of State of Palestine. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the representative of Maldives for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of Namibia to take the floor.
Mr. President, my delegation appreciates the respect and honor bestowed on His Excellency Samuel Rudolph Nsunali, the President of the 48th United Nations General Assembly this morning. We remember his steadfast support for the cause of Namibia, our right to self-determination, freedom and independence, through his active role as a Vice President of the then Council for Namibia. These are the same expectations and rights that we are eagerly awaiting to be extended to the people of Palestine. I extend my gratitude to the Secretary General for the insightful report on the economic repercussions of the Israeli occupation for the Palestinian people, particularly the welfare cost resulting from the fragmentation of the occupied West Bank. We also appreciate the report presented by the Committee on the Inalienable Right of the Palestinian People. Tomorrow, the government of the Republic of Namibia will stand in solidarity with the international community to observe the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Regrettably, this occasion occurs amidst a continued surge in violence marked by brutal force. In the past 2 months alone, over 14,000 Palestinians, including 4,000 women and more than 6,000 children, and over 100 United Nations employees have tragically lost their lives in this escalated violence. Despite the clear breaches of international law and humanitarian principles, the United Nations Charter has not consistently provided a safeguard. The occupation of Palestine, with its illegal nature, has brought about severe economic, social, cultural, and humanitarian consequences. The continual violation of international law and numerous resolutions from the General Assembly and the Security Council is deeply concerning. The world continues to witness in horror the unabated full-scale aggression against the Palestinian people, sparing neither hospitals, refugee camps, holy sites, nor schools. These are clear violations of international law and international humanitarian law. This abnormality requires urgent attention and a collective responsibility to resolve this long-standing conflict. Mr. President, Namibia welcomes the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2712. While we call for an immediate and permanent cessation of violence and abated aggression, we thank the governments of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States for their invaluable role in facilitating these humanitarian pauses. We, however, condemn reports of violence against outside Gaza, including the latest attack on the Jenin refugee camp. Namibia reiterates her call for unhindered access to humanitarian aid for the most vulnerable and an immediate end to the forced mass displacement of the Palestinian people. Earlier this year, the Namibian government made a submission to the International Court of Justice as part of the ongoing proceedings and eagerly awaits the advisory opinion of the court to determine the consequences of Israel's continued illegal occupation of Palestine. The international community must intensify its efforts to realize a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in the Middle East based on relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. Israel must be held accountable for continually violating these resolutions. Mr. President, as we approach the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we must reflect on how the people of Palestine relate to human rights, which are supposed to be indivisible, inalienable, and universal. The exercise of Palestinian self-determination and statehood has been severely impaired by unlawful measures, including settlement expansion and the construction of barriers in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem. Namibia stands unwavering in its support for the Palestinian people until they can exercise their inalienable right to self-determination. The question of Palestine demands resolution. Collectively, we bear responsibility to strengthen our resolve in the face of injustice to make this a reality. The moment is now. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Namibia for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, today's meeting takes place at a critical juncture. The state of Palestine and the Palestinian people are facing the biggest tragedy in recent history. The scale of destruction and loss is at unimaginable levels. Since the 7th of October, the death toll in Gaza reached nearly 15,000, mostly women and children. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, mosques, churches, schools, refugee camps, have been under constant bombardment. Almost half of the housing units are destroyed. Over 2 million Palestinians are in dire need of humanitarian aid. They are being subjected to acts of collective punishment and forced displacement. International law and international humanitarian law are constantly being violated. The UN agencies have been repeatedly maintaining for the last few weeks that nowhere is safe in Gaza. The Secretary General described the current state of Gaza as a graveyard for children. UNICEF Executive Director referred to Gaza as the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. No one is spared from the brutal Israeli attacks, even under the UN flag. We commend the UN agencies and the humanitarians who are working on the ground under unbearable conditions, even after becoming victims themselves. We express our deepest condolences for over 100 brave UN personnel who lost their lives in this honorable mission. Mr. President, since the outset of the conflict, Turkey has been calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, urgent and unimpeded humanitarian access, and full compliance with international law. We hope that the agreement reached last week between Israel and Hamas can lead to a more life-saving aid to reach Gaza and safe return of the remaining hostages. However, it is clear that only a durable ceasefire can prevent further violence and suffering. The unhindered flow of sufficient humanitarian aid must reach all people in need in Gaza. Civilians and civilian infrastructure, including the UN facilities hosting displaced people, must be protected everywhere. Forced displacements of the Palestinians must stop. International law should be upheld. Mr. President, to stop the carnage in Gaza, Turkey has mobilized all diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. OIC Arab League leaders met in Riyadh on 11th of November at the joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit. They strongly condemned the Israeli aggression in Gaza and called for an immediate ceasefire and sustainable humanitarian access. Our foreign ministers have been visiting major capitals to initiate international action to stop the war in Gaza. Minister Fidan, alongside with other ministers, will be here in New York tomorrow to attend the Security Council briefing on Palestine. We have been doing our utmost to send the much-needed humanitarian aid to Gaza. So far, Turkey has sent over 200 tons of humanitarian aid to Egypt's Al Arish airport via 11 aircrafts. We have transferred 88 patients from the Turkish-Palestinian Friendship Hospital in Gaza to Turkey to continue their treatments. Our humanitarian aid workers and health personnel are working tirelessly on the ground. Once again, I thank brotherly Egypt for their efforts and cooperation. Mr. President, we welcome the adoption of Resolution 2712 at the Security Council. However, the failure of the Security Council to adopt any decision for almost 6 weeks or to call for an immediate ceasefire cannot go unnoticed. The UN Security Council and its members have a special responsibility to stop this war that they cannot abstain from. The humanitarian resolution by the General Assembly at its emergency special session, which we have co-sponsored, remains the strongest voice and common position of the international community to the Israeli aggression. Mr. President, we should all be very clear about the root causes of the problem, which is the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory by Israel. The report of the committee before us today once again reveals Israel's continued violations of international law and UN resolutions while pretending the Palestinian people from exercising their right to self-determination and other rights. For decades, the basic rights of Palestinian people have been unjustly stripped away from them, including their economic rights. And now, on top of the unbearable humanitarian catastrophe, the Palestinian people will suffer the economic cost of this war for decades. Mr. President, let me conclude by reiterating Turkey's unwavering support to all efforts towards finding a comprehensive and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on a two-state vision and pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Palestine. We stand with the Palestinian people in reaching their long-delayed right to live in their own sovereign and independent state. And I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Turkey for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank you for convening this meeting to discuss item 35, entitled The Question of Palestine. The debate of the General Assembly on this item comes at a delicate moment for Palestine and the Middle East as a result of the unjust Israeli aggression against Palestinian territory, specifically the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the magnitude of the latest Israeli attacks are unprecedented over the long history of Israeli aggressions against Palestinian people. Civilian casualties reached unbelievable levels. The destruction of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, residential buildings, and even UN facilities. The destruction we've seen in different towns in Gaza is unprecedented. Israel continues to indiscriminately shell towns. It is imposing a siege on the Palestinian people. Restrictions are imposed on the delivery of humanitarian aid. This is an attempt to make life impossible in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, the temporary truce that is holding right now, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States have contributed to reaching this truce. This truce does not obviate the need for a ceasefire to stop the bloodshed and to stop a regional spillover. At this juncture, we have to recall GA resolution that called for a permanent ceasefire that would follow the humanitarian truce. We recall that this resolution that was adopted during the emergency special session was adopted by the vast majority of member states. Mr. President, we call for something else that is equally important, which is rescuing the civilians in Gaza, our brethren, the civilians in Gaza. Their suffering has been going on for so long as a result of starvation, as a result of displacement, as a result of the siege. Israel must allow for the delivery of humanitarian aid without any obstacles through all border crossings into the Gaza Strip. The United Nations, especially the Security Council, must shoulder its full responsibility in this regard. Mr. President, the flagrant Israeli violations against the Palestinian people is not a new phenomenon. The report of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, contained in document A/78/35, paints a grim picture of these violations. In paragraph 9, it addresses the bombardment and shelling. In paragraph 10, it refers to the increase in annexation operations and the building of illegal settlements. Paragraph 12 in the report addresses the brutal attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian citizens. We've witnessed 849 attacks. Paragraph 17 addresses the repeated and systematic Israeli attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque with the support of members of the Israeli government. Mr. President, the horrific statistics contained in the report of the committee do not even include the current violation since the beginning of the war against Gaza and the events of the 7th of October. The number of civilians has doubled many times to this day. That includes the killing of thousands of civilians at the hands of the occupying powers and the killings of hundreds of Palestinians in the West Bank. The only guarantee, Mr. President, to stop these violations is to stop the Israeli occupation and to establish the independent state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June 1967 in the implementation of UN resolutions, including the multiple resolutions adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations. The two-state solution, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, is the only viable way. There is no alternative. The only viable way to guarantee the rights of Palestinians and Israelis to live in safety and peace in normal conditions in two independent states as all other peoples, according to international resolutions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Egypt for his statement, and I now offer the floor to the distinguished representative of Jordan.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. بداية اسمح لي أن أتوجه.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to begin by thanking you and express our thanks to you for your efforts that you are deploying for a successful conclusion of the work of the 78th session of the General Assembly. We wish you every success in these efforts. We also reiterate the support of Jordan to the Committee for the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Efforts to defend those rights, particularly the right to self-determination, and to find a response to the legitimate aspirations for a sovereign state according to relevant resolutions and international legitimacy. This meeting, Mr. President, is being held at a very critical time. The Palestinian people are experiencing abject aggression on the part of Israel against innocent civilians that has led to the loss of more than 16,000 Palestinian lives, 70% of them women and children. That's something that has to stop. The international community must mobilize its efforts. The Security Council must also mobilize to put an end to this war permanently in order to protect the civilians in Gaza, men, women, and the elderly. There must be access in a permanent way to humanitarian assistance and also guarantee the protection of hospitals, schools, and UN institutions and also medical equipment. In this regard, I would like to state that a position that is not clear and strict with regard to putting an end to these crimes by Israel only encourages this aggression to continue, particularly with regard to double standards and selectivity with regard to the implementation of international law. We call upon the Security Council to assume its legal and moral responsibilities in order to put an end to this aggression that has lasted for far too long and protect the Palestinians in Gaza, but everywhere on Palestinian territory. And we would warn against the consequences of an escalation in the occupied West Bank, particularly with the terrorism of the Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians. The illegal Israeli measures that continue only worsen the occupation and the despair and leads to more conflicts and injustice. My country reiterates its support also for UNRWA. UNRWA, which provides humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in Gaza when those people are facing the disaster of the Israeli aggression. And UNRWA should be supported, but Israel has killed more than 100 UNRWA staff since the beginning of the conflict, and we have a collective responsibility to protect UNRWA, to strengthen the rights of the Palestinian people, and protect an agency that has paid sacrifices and shown that it is able to work efficiently according to the principles of humanity. We also need to financially support UNRWA so that it's able to play its vital, essential role, particularly with regard to the disastrous consequences that are being made even worse by this Israeli aggression. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome the efforts of Qatar, Egypt, and the United States that have made it possible for there to be a humanitarian truce agreed in the Gaza Strip. We also believe that this truce should be a step towards a total cessation of the war in Gaza. This truce needs to put an end to the escalation and the forced displacement of Palestinians. It should also facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout the Gaza Strip in order to respond to the needs of Palestinian civilians and also in order to increase stability so that the Gazan people can stay where they are. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Palestinian question has been and will remain the central issue for Jordanians, and we would like to see a resumption of peace under international legitimacy, guaranteeing the rights of the Palestinian people to a viable state with East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem as its capital along the 1967 lines. And the solution of two states is the only way to ensure perennial peace in the entire region. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jordan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's debate offers an opportunity to not only reflect on the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, created by the war waged by Israel against the Palestinian people, but to also take stock of the implementation of Resolution ES 10/21 adopted by the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly on 27th October 2023, which called for a humanitarian truce leading to cessation of hostilities, unimpeded supplies of relief goods, and a stop to the illegal forced displacements. We regret that the General Assembly's call was not heeded by Israel, which continued its indiscriminate and criminal attacks against the Palestinian people. Israel also ignored the call from the Security Council to comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, notably with regard to the protection of civilians, especially children, and to refrain from depriving the civilian population in Gaza of basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to their survival. We strongly and unequivocally condemn the indiscriminate use of force by Israel, Israel's attacks on civilians, civilian objects and infrastructure, blockading of water, food and fuel, as well as the forced displacement of people within the occupied territory are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and may amount to the crime of genocide. Mr. President, we take note of the reports regarding the agreement among the relevant parties for a humanitarian pause. We appreciate the efforts undertaken by Qatar and Egypt towards this end. Pakistan's position, however, remains in favor of a complete and immediate cessation of hostilities. The Israeli killing machine operating with complete impunity needs to be stopped, and Israel must be held accountable for its defiance and criminal actions. Amid these extremely challenging times, the government and the people of Pakistan wholeheartedly extend their unwavering solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters facing the brutal onslaught from Israeli occupation forces. The suffering and collective punishment endured by the besieged people of Gaza is unprecedented in modern history. More than 14,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, 2/3 of them women and children. Tens of thousands have been injured. Around 2,700, including 1,500 children, have been reported missing or dead or trapped under the rubble. In excess of 1.7 million Gazans have been displaced and over 41,000 housing units destroyed. Only 2 small hospitals in northern Gaza are partially operational, with the remaining 22 out of service. Of the 11 medical facilities in the south, only 7 are currently functional. 108 UNRWA staff have been killed in Gaza since 7th October. At least 53 journalists have been killed since the hostilities began. We reject Israel's portrayal of its aggressive actions as anti-terrorism measures and its relentless bombing of Gaza as an exercise of self-defense. The root cause of the crisis lies in Israel's prolonged occupation and denial of Palestinians' inalienable right to self-determination. Israel's murderous campaign against the occupied people of Palestine struggling for their freedom cannot be justified under the guise of self-defense. Mr. President, the joint extraordinary Arab and Islamic summit held in Riyadh on 11 November 2023 underscored the centrality of the Palestinian cause and extended full support for the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people to liberate all their occupied territories and the need to end the Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people. It described the ongoing Israeli aggression as a retaliatory war crime that cannot be justified under any guise, and demanded that all countries stop exporting weapons and ammunition to the occupation authorities that are used by their army and terrorist settlers to kill the Palestinian people and destroy their homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, and properties. We welcome the visits to P5 capitals by the ministerial committee mandated by the Joint Arab-Islamic Extraordinary Summit, chaired by the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, and hope that it will lead to meaningful action from the Security Council to halt the Israeli slaughter, impose a durable ceasefire, enable humanitarian assistance, and revive the peace process. We hope the Security Council will not be paralyzed again by the partisan position of some delegations. We are confident that under China's leadership, the Security Council will fulfill its mandate for the maintenance of peace and security. Mr. President, Israel must comply with the provisions of the resolution adopted by the Assembly by implementing an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and allowing the flow of sufficient, sustained, and unimpeded humanitarian assistance into Gaza to preserve lives and prevent further suffering of innocent Palestinians. The General Assembly and the Security Council should also consider the following. 1. Establishment of a special tribunal and accountability mechanism to investigate Israel's atrocity crimes, identify and prosecute those responsible for war crimes committed, and to provide reparations for damage, loss, or injury arising from these crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces. 2. Deployment of an international protection force or mechanism to protect Palestinian civilians, especially women and children, in Gaza and the West Bank from further attacks and oppression by the occupation forces and extremist colonial settlers. 3. Restore and reinvigorate the peace process. The Middle East Quartet should revive its efforts under the auspices of the Secretary General. It should be expanded to include participation of the OIC and China to establish a durable solution based on the internationally agreed two-state solution with a secure, viable, contiguous, and sovereign state of Palestine on the basis of pre-June 1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. 4th, Pakistan will support the convening of an international conference to launch a revived peace process and support the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now invite the distinguished representative of South Africa to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. South Africa aligns itself with the statement delivered by Malaysia on behalf of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. We join other member states in thanking the Secretariat of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, for its report titled Economic Costs of the Israeli Occupation for the Palestinian People, the welfare cost of the fragmentation of the occupied West Bank. We also express our appreciation to the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for its report. South Africa expresses its grave concern over the devastating escalation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We extend our deepest condolences to all victims and call for the immediate cessation of violence and an end to the indiscriminate attacks by Israel on the civilian population in Gaza. Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine and its illegal settlement expansion is a flagrant violation under international law and in direct contravention of UN Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2023. Consequently, these illegal practices by Israel adversely affects all aspects of the Palestinian lives, including all economic activity, social development, livelihoods, and household welfare. The impact is more grave, as outlined in the UNCTAD report, in Area C of West Bank, which is the focus of the UNCTAD's report. Area C, which is fully controlled by Israel, accounts for more than 60% of the occupied West Bank. It is home to an estimated 300,000 Palestinians who live in 532 residential areas. Whilst approximately 60% of Area C consists of Israeli state land, Palestinians struggle to obtain land permits for housing and farming in the remaining 40%. The economic impact of Israel's occupation is that 33% of Palestinian communities in Area C lack primary school education. 70% of communities do not have access to potable water, and access to primary health care is impeded. UNCTAD's report makes the case that if the restrictions imposed on Area C were reduced to similar levels as Areas A and B, as a step forward to ending the occupation, in line with relevant United Nations resolution, total Palestinian household expenditure would increase significantly by up to 200% in some locations of Area C, thereby contributing to a substantial reduction in levels of poverty. Mr. President, since the beginning of the escalation of hostilities on 7 October, the world has had the repeated assertion that Israel has a right to defend itself based on its inalienable right to self-determination. However, very little, if anything, is said by the same states about Palestine's inalienable right to self-determination. The report of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People contains numerous examples of Israel's continued disregard for Palestinians' inalienable rights during the reporting period from September 2022 to August 2023. The selective application of international law undermines the effectiveness of collective responses to global security threats. Israel, as the occupying power, must be held legally and politically accountable for the structural violence and suffering of its occupation that it inflicts on Palestinians. As the international community, we have a responsibility to work tirelessly towards supporting and calling for the immediate and unconditional end to Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. Our collective human duty to act cannot be avoided. We must proceed together with due regard to international law, international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and resolutions adopted by the United Nations. We welcome the humanitarian pause to allow for relief aid into Gaza. We also need a ceasefire now, which will end the suffering of the Palestinian people and create impetus for a comprehensive political dialogue. And here we wish to recognize the good work that is being done by UNRWA and the ICRC under very difficult circumstances. South Africa remains committed to the full realization of the right to self-determination of the people of Palestine in accordance with the international law, and is committed to working with the international community to ensure a lasting and durable peace that produces a viable, contiguous Palestinian state existing side by side in peace with Israel within the 1967 internationally recognized borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. To this end, like its mediation in conflicts in Africa and other parts of the world, South Africa stands ready to contribute to the peaceful resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of South Africa for his statement. And now I'd like to offer the floor to His Excellency Zambry Abdul Kadir, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia aligns itself with the statement delivered by Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, or OIC. I would also like to thank the Secretary General and Chairman of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian people for the report. Mr. President, we have been grappling with the question of Palestine for decades. Here in this august chamber, countless views have been articulated in numerous proceedings, producing voluminous reports and quite a few resolutions. The Palestinian question is indeed a long-standing problem that this organization and the entire international community has failed to resolve, despite all efforts. To this day, the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination continues to be denied. Palestinians continue to be dispossessed, not only of their lands and homes, but also of their basic human rights and dignity. They continue to be oppressed in many unimaginable, inhumane ways. They continue to be seen and treated as subhumans by their occupiers, who continue to impose upon them repressive apartheid policy. And the world continues to ignore their sufferings. Almost every time when violence flare-ups, we would call for meetings not unlike the one we are having now, reiterate our support for the Palestinians' right for statehood and the two-state solutions, and issues another resolution recalling previous resolutions which have been almost entirely ignored. Then nothing happened. Another resolutions ignored, and the perpetrators is let off with impunity. Occupations and operations resumes. For how long more are we going to let this continue? Mr. President, we all know, and we have been saying this, the current violent outbreak in the region does not happen in a vacuum. The backdrop is over 70 years of illegal occupations of Palestinian land and the inhuman oppression of the Palestinians by the occupying powers, that is Israel. The people of Gaza have been living in what has been described as the biggest open-air prison in the world due to the Israel's brutal land, sea, and air blockade. In recent years, Israel's actions have become increasingly belligerent, which can be seen by the rising incidences of hate speech and provocative actions by some of the high-ranking government officials, the extremely disproportionate and violent operation of the Israeli forces in the occupied Palestinian territories that have caused record numbers of civilian deaths, injuries, and destruction of home and civilian infrastructure, as well as the rise in settler violence toward Palestinians. The 2023 report of the United Nations, the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people and other Arabs of the occupied territories, of which Malaysia is a member, makes the following observations. As of August 2023, Israeli forces had already killed more Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories this year compared to any other year since 2005. As of September 2023, Israel was holding 1,264 Palestinians in administrative detention, the highest number in over a decade. Up until September this year, UN OCHA documented an average of 3 instances of settler violence a day in 2023 compared to an average of 2 per day in 2022 and 1 per day in 2021. This is the highest daily average of settler-related incidents affecting Palestinians since the UN started recording this data in 2006. Those are just a few facts extracted from the report, denoting the extremely volatile situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, even before the horrendous events of October 7th. Mr. President, Malaysia welcomes the agreement for a humanitarian pause in Gaza, reached on the 22nd November, and applaud all parties that work extremely hard to achieve it. The agreement is an important step in the right direction to stop further loss of innocent life and enable the desperately needed humanitarian aid be supplied into Gaza in sufficient quantities. We further commend the decision to extend the humanitarian pause. However, it is hugely disappointing that the pause in hostilities could only be reached only after more than 6 weeks of Israeli rampage and collective punishments of the people in Gaza, causing carnage of thousands of innocent lives, destruction, and humanitarian situation of apocalyptic proportions. The humanitarian pause only happened almost 4 weeks after 121 countries resoundingly called for humanitarian truce, leading to a cessation of hostilities during the emergency special session of the General Assembly. It took place only after numerous pleas by UN agencies and the Secretary General, who had described the Gaza as hell on earth and a graveyard for children. The humanitarian pause was only agreed after millions of people marched in capitals all around the world, united and unequivocal in their chant of ceasefire now. The sad fact is that the humanitarian pause happened only after close to 15,000 Palestinians, including about 4,000 women and 6,000 children, had been killed in Gaza, and approximately 2,700 people, including around 1,200 children, had been reported missing and may be trapped or dead under the rubble. Over 1.7 million people in Gaza are estimated to have been internally displaced. Humanitarian organizations Save the Children reported that the numbers of children killed in Gaza by the end of October had surpassed the annual numbers of children killed in all conflict zones across the world since 2019. Malaysia joins the resolute call by the clear majority of UN member states for a full ceasefire. The vicious massacre of civilian life must not resume. The shelling of civilian infrastructures, including hospitals, schools, and United Nations premises, are heinous war crimes and must not resume. The cutting off the supply of water, electricity, and communication services is against international law and must not continue. The forced displacement of Palestinians is also unlawful. It must be stopped and reversed, and the unhindered flow of humanitarian aid up to scale must be guaranteed throughout Gaza. Malaysia, like many other member states, continue to be gravely concerned with the dire humanitarian condition in Gaza. Malaysia has been a regular contributor to UN UNRWA. Since the war in Gaza broke out, Malaysia has made an additional contribution of over $2 million to UNRWA. We salute all the humanitarian heroes who continue to risk their lives to serve the people of Gaza. We extend our deepest condolences to the families and colleagues of over 100 UNRWA staff who have lost their life in Gaza since the start of the war. Malaysia finds find it deeply disconcerting that the current war in Gaza has been the deadliest conflict ever for UN employees. Malaysia has also sent 2 plane loads of humanitarian aid to the region. We thank Egypt for its cooperation. The Malaysian public, NGOs, and private sector continue to raise funds to support the humanitarian needs of the people in Gaza. So far, they have raised around $5 million USD for Malaysia's humanitarian trust fund for the people of Palestine. Malaysia is ready to work with all international partners in humanitarian efforts to ease the sufferings of the people in Gaza. Mr. President, we must stop the vicious cycle of violence in the region. The international community must not continue paying lip service to the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. We must take real and decisive actions. We can no longer deny the fact that the only way to achieve peace and security in the region and solve the question of Palestinians is to make every effort to support the establishment of a free and independent state of Palestine in accordance with the two-state solution based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The illegal and inhumane occupation by Israel of Palestinian land must end. It is the only solution. Moving forward, it is important that the voice of the Palestinian people be heard loud and clear in charting their own future. Palestinians must be involved front and center in any discussion on the future governance of their nation. The wishes of the Palestinians must be at the core of the discussion. It is the only way to ensure the credibility of the process and its success. Importantly, the principle of justice and accountability must be upheld. All violations of international law must be properly investigated. There must not be impunity for those who commit war crimes. Impunity and double standards in applying international law only encourage further violations. The war in Gaza is a litmus test for the international community and this organization. War crimes have been clearly and blatantly committed in this war. Failure to bring perpetrators of war crimes to justice will only confirm the perception of hypocrisy, selectivity, and double standards. It will further erode trust in the multilateral system, which would be disastrous in this time of numerous multifaceted global challenges. The implications of failure to uphold international law are undoubtedly far-reaching. Diminished trust in multilateral institutions pave the way for unilateral actions, for might override, and for a world where the principles of international law become mere suggestions rather than binding norms. This is a dangerous path, one that can lead to more conflict, suffering, and injustice. Let us turn this dark moment in our history into an opportunity to revive our commitment to a fair and just world order, as called by the Secretary General in his policy brief, New Agenda for Peace. Let us work towards strengthening our multilateral institutions, ensuring they stand as beacons of fairness, justice, and equality. Only then can we hope to build a world where trust in our international system is restored and where peace and justice are not just aspirational goals, but tangible realities for all. Mr. President, we must not wait any longer. It is time to deliver to the Palestinians their equal and rightful place among us, the free nation of the world. It is time for a free and independent state of Palestine. I thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia, and I now invite the distinguished representative of India to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. On the occasion of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people tomorrow, which is 29 November, let me at the outset reaffirm our long-standing relationship with the Palestinian people based on deep-rooted historical and people-to-people ties and our consistent support to the people of Palestine in their endeavor for statehood, peace, and prosperity. We are gathered today, Mr. President, at a time when the security situation in the Middle East is deteriorating due to the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict, with a large-scale loss of civilian lives, especially women and children, and an alarming humanitarian crisis. This is clearly unacceptable, and we have indeed strongly condemned the death of civilians. In addressing this humanitarian crisis, Mr. President, it is necessary for all parties to display the utmost responsibility. In this, we welcome all efforts by the international community that would lead to a de-escalation and delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people of Palestine. The humanitarian pauses is a welcome step to ensure timely and continuous delivery of humanitarian aid. We, on our part, have sent 70 tons of humanitarian goods, including 16.5 tons of medicines and medical supplies. We are aware, Mr. President, that the immediate trigger were the terror attacks in Israel on 7 October, which were shocking and deserve our unequivocal condemnation. There can be no justification for terrorism and hostage-taking. Our thoughts are with those who have been taken as hostages. While we welcome the news of the release of the hostages, we also call for the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. India has a zero-tolerance approach to terrorism. We also believe that there is a universal obligation to observe international humanitarian law. I will add, Mr. President, that since the start of the conflict, my Prime Minister and External Affairs Minister have been in close contact with leaders of the region and beyond, where they have emphasized a consistent message that it is important to prevent escalation, ensure continued delivery of humanitarian aid, and work towards an early restoration of peace and stability. Along with restraint, they have also emphasized a peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and diplomacy. India also urges the parties to work toward creating conditions necessary for peace and the restarting of direct negotiations between the parties, including through an eschewing of violence and de-escalation. India has always supported a negotiated two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine issue, leading to the establishment of a sovereign, independent, and viable state of Palestine, living within secure and recognized borders, side by side in peace with Israel. India, on its part, Mr. President, will continue to support the Palestinian people through our bilateral development partnership, which covers a wide range of sectors, including health, education, women's empowerment, entrepreneurship, and information technology, and will also continue to send humanitarian assistance to the people of Palestine. And as I conclude, Mr. President, let me reaffirm India's firm commitment to achieving a just, peaceful, and lasting solution to the Israel-Palestine issue. We firmly believe that not only a two-state solution achieved through direct and meaningful negotiations between both sides on final status issues will deliver an enduring peace that the people of Israel and Palestine desire and deserve. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of India. And now I have pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela robustly condemns the Israeli aggression against the civilian population in the occupied Palestinian territories. This is an operation of mass expulsion of an entire people in order to annex their territory by the occupying power. It's a new cycle of expansionist terror of so many that have been suffered by the Palestinian people over 75 years of occupation. Over the last 8 weeks, we have seen an escalation of the crimes perpetrated by the Israeli regime against the Palestinian people. Almost 15,000 innocent civilians have been murdered by the occupation forces in the Gaza Strip, mainly women and children, in an operation of ethnic cleansing, which has not even spared the staff of the United Nations that have also been massacred. It is repugnant to see how, despite the cruelty of the facts that are on view to the world, the government of the United States of America and its satellites aim to justify the unjustifiable, that the occupying power is carrying out a genocide against the Palestinian people, as defined in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. We ask ourselves, where are those who in other cases rush to apply the responsibility to protect, but now are ignoring the human rights of Palestinians submitted to the Israeli occupation? Where are the activists on the Code of Conduct of the Security Council against genocide, or those advocating for a reduction in the right of veto in the Security Council when mass atrocities are being committed? Their silence makes them an accomplice in these crimes. We call for a condemnation in the firmest terms of the criminal policies of Israel against the civilian population. The United Nations must act with determination, including the Secretariat, that has a crucial role to play in preserving the right to life of millions of innocent people. We cannot allow that our actions and our omissions make us jointly responsible for the annihilation of an entire people. Mr. President, Israel has no intention of putting an end to the occupation. On the contrary, it aims to wrest control of the entire occupied Palestinian territory while it alters the demographic situation, repressing Palestinians and privileging Israeli settlers. This is a case of the imposition of a system of apartheid. To this reality, we must add the destruction of tens of thousands of dwellings, the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, as well as the deliberate attacks against vital infrastructure. Mr. President, today we must make progress as a matter of urgency in at least 3 critical areas. Firstly, we must put an end to the cycle of impunity. Israel must be held accountable by international justice for the crimes against humanity and war crimes that it has been committing over years, as well as for the genocide underway today. The international impunity provided to it by a government of one of its main partners that is a permanent member of the Security Council. This encourages the crimes committed daily by Israel. Secondly, whilst the occupying power continues with its policies of shoot to kill, bombing schools, hospitals, housing, refugee centres or food storage facilities, as well as the systemic violence on the part of Israeli settlers against the innocent civilian population, we must apply provisional measures under international humanitarian law that will guarantee the international protection of the Palestinian people. And thirdly, an end must be put to the illegal settlement policy, the evictions and demolition of homes, the expropriation of Palestinian land, to the arbitrary detentions of innocent Palestinian civilians, and the persecution of civil society Palestinian organizations. We must repudiate those who call for the use of weapons of mass destruction against the Palestinian people and that encourage fanatical groups to commit hate crimes or attack religious sites. Mr. President, on the other hand, we insist on our rejection of the lack of compliance with the provisions of Resolution 497 of the Security Council, which for more than 40 years now has demanded the withdrawal of Israel from the Syrian Golan. And we also reject any actions taken by the occupying power to change the demographic or legal situation of the occupied Syrian Golan. We reject any measures that use force to exercise jurisdiction and administration in this territory. The time has come for this General Assembly to demand concrete action, and that's why we urge a vote in favour of all of the draft resolutions tabled today under items 39 and 40 of the programme of work. Finally, we reaffirm our solidarity with the Palestinian people, as well as our support for their self-determination and a Palestinian state that is independent and sovereign within the pre-1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital and as a full member of the United Nations. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Venezuela, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Philippines.
Mr. President, a few days ago, we celebrated the release of a Filipino national, one of the first 24 hostages freed by Hamas after nearly 50 days in captivity in Gaza. He will soon be reunited with his family and loved ones in the Philippines. As we gather today, we are optimistic that the negotiations leading to this humanitarian pause will further expedite the delivery of aid to Gaza and facilitate the swift release of all remaining hostages. We commend the efforts of all parties involved in this diplomatic breakthrough. The Philippines reiterates its dedication to supporting peace and stability in the Middle East with a focused commitment to resolving the Israeli-Hamas hostilities. The presence of a significant Filipino community in the Middle East and Israel accentuates the relevance of this issue to the Philippines and highlights the importance of our profound concern about the peace process. The Philippines supports the full and immediate implementation of the resolution on protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations adopted by the 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly in the UN Security Council Resolution 2712 on urgent and extended the humanitarian pauses and corridors in Gaza. We recognize the staggering loss of life and the suffering of all civilians affected by the conflict and condemn all forms of violence and aggression from any party. The safety and security of all civilians is essential, and critical facilities, including humanitarian shelters and hospitals, need to continue to address the humanitarian needs of those affected in sustained and resolute manner. The Philippines stands in solemn solidarity with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East and the families of over 100 brave personnel who perished since October 7 while on duty in Gaza. We honor their sacrifice in the name of peace. We support the efforts of the United Nations to deliver urgent humanitarian assistance and essential supplies to Palestinian civilians and caught in the midst of the conflict in Gaza, and commend UNRWA and UNOCHA and other related UN agencies for their efforts and sacrifice amidst these challenging times. The Philippines recognizes that the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is key to the region's peace and stability. We urge all concerned parties to immediately put in place urgent solutions that would prevent the conflict from further escalating, spreading, and protracting. It is in the interest of Israeli and Palestinian civilians and all states in the region that this conflict does not spread further beyond Gaza and engulfing the wider region in conflict. We support the peaceful implementation of all UN resolutions and initiatives towards the resolution of the Middle East conflict and support all efforts to revive the Middle East peace process. The Philippines reiterates its firm support for a two-state solution consistently aligned with relevant UN resolutions and international agreements. Both Israelis and Palestinians deserve a future where their rights and aspirations and security are recognized and upheld. Given the significant impact of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the region's stability, we believe that a lasting resolution can only emerge from diplomatic engagement, dialogue, and comprehensive negotiation between the parties involved, all rooted in international law. Mr. President, collective action and meaningful dialogue are cornerstones of true peace. The Philippines is dedicated to fostering a deeper understanding and collaborative efforts as we navigate this complex and layered issue with a comprehensive and sustained approach. We call upon nations, communities, and individuals dedicated to our shared human values to be united in this endeavor, not just in seeking temporary relief, but in pursuing lasting peace and dignity for all within the region. It is in unity that we find our greatest hope for a peaceful future in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Filipinas. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of Morocco.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank you and Ambassador Yang and the members of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People for the efforts made by the committee to find a settlement to the question of Palestine according to international resolution. This annual debate coincides with a very delicate juncture, not only for the question of Palestine, which is the core of peace in the Middle East, but also because of upheavals in the region. The Kingdom of Morocco, under the leadership of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the chair of the Quds Committee, attaches great importance to the question of Palestine. We believe the question of Palestine is the core issue in the Middle East. The Kingdom of Morocco reiterates its grave concern over the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza and the loss of lives and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The Kingdom of Morocco stressed that these escalatory steps by Israel are inconsistent with international law, with international values, and undermine the prospects of peace in the region. The Kingdom of Morocco welcomes a temporary truce to stop hostilities in Gaza. We value the efforts by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States that led to the conclusion of this important agreement, which can lead to a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. The Kingdom of Morocco stresses the importance of protecting all civilians and not targeting civilians. According to international law, international humanitarian law, it is also important to ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid, the delivery of sufficient amounts of humanitarian aid. It is important to release detainees and hostages and create political prospects for the settlement of the question of Palestine. We reject the forced displacement of Palestinians and any threat to the national security of neighboring states. The adoption of two resolutions, Security Council resolutions 2712 and the resolution during the emergency special session reflects the desire by the international community to stop this war. In addition, any unilateral measures that are inconsistent with international law, including in Jerusalem, lead to more schism between the Israelis and Palestinians, and would also push for more violence and radicalization. Mr. President, His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may God protect him, in his statement before the extraordinary session in Riyadh, and I quote, "We must address this urgent situation and we must shoulder our responsibility. There is no peace in the region without granting the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people as part of the two-state solution. There is no alternative to an independent Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. There is no alternative to the Palestinian Authority under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. There is no alternative to permanent security arrangements without relying on international resolutions." End of quote. Mr. President, King Mohammed VI, as chair of the Quds Committee, is following with great concern the developments in the question of Palestine. He calls for getting out of the cycle of violence towards more cooperation to achieve prosperity for all the nations of the region. His Majesty stresses the importance of upholding the religious heritage in Jerusalem. It's a common heritage of mankind, and it's a sacred place for the worshippers of the three Abrahamic religions. It is a symbol for coexistence, as stated in the Quds Call that was signed by Pope Francis and His Majesty. Al-Quds Committee is playing its practical and political role to support the Palestinian people in general and Jerusalemites in particular. These efforts complement efforts by His Majesty and efforts made on the ground under the personal supervision of His Majesty. Beit al-Mal agency has sent assistance to hospitals that are dealing with a dire social and medical situation in Gaza as a result of the current developments. The Kingdom of Morocco, under instructions of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, has presented more aid to Palestine. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Kingdom of Morocco reiterates its firm commitment to the question of Palestine, to the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. First and foremost, their right to establish an independent Palestinian state along the lines of the 4th of June 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side with Israel as the only way to ensure peace and stability in the region. I thank you.
Distinguished representative of the Kingdom of Morocco. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today we take the floor to address yet another one-sided, disproportionate, detached, and biased briefing, fueled by a distorted and destructive political agenda. The deep hypocrisies and systematic bias weaponized against Israel at the United Nations is based on a false narrative which not only entrenches and perpetuates conflict, but enables and encourages hatred and violence. In the wake of Hamas's October 7th massacre, the UN's twisted anti-Israel bias has been on clear display for the world to see. Thousands of savage Hamas terrorists flooded Israel, carrying out the most widespread and brutal bloodshed of the Jewish people since the dark days of the Holocaust. More than 1,200 Israelis were murdered, raped, and brutalized. 240 were taken hostage, among them 40 children and babies. The extent of Hamas's atrocities has not been addressed or recognized by the United Nations agencies, and especially not by the committee debated here today, let alone was it condemned. It is incomprehensible that the United Nations finance and resources are invested in the work of a committee which completely ignores Hamas's savage brutality and terror. Instead of denouncing heinous acts of terror by Hamas, instead of denouncing slaughter of children, burning of entire families, mass rape of women, this assembly continues to pass resolutions year after year exclusively condemning Israel, while remaining silent in the face of the most heinous crimes committed by Hamas terrorists. This is the textbook definition of a double standard. It is also the textbook definition of anti-Semitism. It is reprehensible that we are once again forced to bear witness to the charade of these halls, ignoring atrocities for the mere sake of demonizing Israel, all while this body gives it its full backing. This report is the product of an illegitimate mandate and is drafted by those who come to the table with a predetermined and discriminatory agenda against Israel. As we stated in the past, Israel strongly objects to the continued operation of this committee. The committee and the debate's sole purpose is clear: to systematically promote anti-Israeli agenda. The very fact that this committee uses UN resources to fund propaganda against a fellow member state is not only unprecedented, but is disgraceful. In this committee's reports, you will not find any reference to the way in which Hamas has imposed its brutal policies on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Nor will you see mention of Hamas diverting humanitarian aid to fund its terrorist activities. You will not read about Hamas seizing goods and raw materials, or about Hamas looting of humanitarian supplies and using them to build terror tunnels and stockpile weapons. You will not hear about the atrocities committed on October 7th. Why would you? It does not fit the agenda of the committee. The committee has been propagating since its inception, despite the fact that you cannot attempt to solve a question without addressing the problem: Palestinian terror driven by genocidal ideology. This is just another example of the infamous double standard reality that Israel faces daily in the halls of the United Nations. For years, many in these halls have given Hamas a free pass. They have shielded terrorist organizations who seek Israel's destruction. They have legitimized their action. They have allowed them to embed themselves within and underneath civilian population. And despite the horrors endured by Israelis on October 7th, it is business as usual at the United Nations. This committee and the supporters will not mention Hamas. They will not condemn violence perpetrated against children and women in their bedrooms. They will not condemn Hamas's use of Palestinians as human shields. And it's no surprise that a body which refuses to denounce the mass murder and rape of Israelis will also, later today, adopt a resolution which ignores a regime responsible for the mass murdering of hundreds of thousands of its own civilians, including with the use of chemical weapons. Instead, the same terror-supporting actors will continue to weaponize this institution against the only democratic Jewish state. Israel will not stand for that. Even if we're one of the only voices of reason willing to stand up to this deranged insanity, we will. We will call to vote against your destructive resolutions. We will call to end your open-ended use of UN mandates and funds for political agendas. And we will call for an end to the United Nations' cynical campaign against the state of Israel. Israel will not be deterred. Not by savage Hamas terrorists, not by the state, their state and non-state supporters, and certainly not by one-sided briefings and resolutions assembled by ruinous UN committees. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel, and now I have the pleasure to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, Guyana aligns itself with the statement delivered by the distinguished representative of Jamaica on behalf of CARICOM and makes a further contribution in its national capacity. Mr. President, we meet at a particularly difficult juncture of the Palestinian people's struggle for justice, freedom, peace, and self-determination. The information presented in the reports of the Committee for the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development present the grim realities of the Palestinians' existence, realities that have worsened exponentially in recent weeks. These realities evidence the deepening political, humanitarian, and economic crisis which the Palestinian people are enduring. They also point to the urgent obligation of the United Nations to secure a permanent and just solution to the question of Palestine. Mr. President, the fundamental reason for the terrible circumstances under which the Palestinian people live remains unchanged. They are denied the right to self-determination and are forced to carry the weight of an oppressive occupation on their backs. This oppression manifests in human rights violations of various sorts, including forced evictions, displacement of communities, confiscation of properties, killing of innocent civilians, grave violations against children, restriction on freedom of movements, among others. Further, Israeli illegal settlement activity has accelerated in contravention of Security Council Resolution 2334 of 2016, which reaffirmed that such settlements have no legal validity. Humanitarian responses to the plight of the Palestinian people, though important, can never substitute for a human rights-based approach. A human rights-based approach is the only way to address the fundamental challenge to the Palestinians' right to self-determination. It is the only way to advance a permanent solution to the question of Palestine. It will signal respect for and recognition of the dignity of the Palestinian people. For these reasons, Guyana reaffirms its support of the General Assembly's request for an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice regarding, inter alia, the legal consequences of the ongoing violation by Israel of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. Mr. President, the events of 7th October and the occupying powers' cataclysmic response to those events continue to reverberate around the globe. Three phrases in particular have resonated deeply and give an accurate sense of the depth of the catastrophe. 1, no place is safe in Gaza. 2, Gaza has become a graveyard for children. And 3, the cost of this war will be measured in children's lives. There shall be no impunity for the flagrant violations of international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law, that we have witnessed on 7th of October and the week since. Guyana calls for the relevant judicial organs, including the International Criminal Court, to ensure accountability for all crimes. Mr. President, the humanitarian truce between Hamas and Israel, which took effect last Friday and was extended for a further 2 days, is a welcome first step towards a complete cessation of hostilities. Guyana calls for a permanent ceasefire. This is critical for the population of the Gaza Strip to begin rebuilding their lives. Mr. President, Guyana calls for focused discussions on practical measures for reestablishing dialogue between Israel and Palestine towards the achievement of the two-state solution. We reaffirm the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders as the only just solution to the question of Palestine. Allow me to conclude by paying tribute to all those who have paid the ultimate price in the Palestinian struggle to live in freedom, peace, and dignity. For those who died in the Nakba, to those whose lives were snuffed out on 7th October and the weeks following. Guyana also acknowledges the plight of all Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. We commit to continue working with the international community for the implementation of a permanent solution to the question of Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guyana. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Argentina reiterates our serious concern given the current situation in the Middle East, in particular in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October. My country once again expresses our robust and unequivocal condemnation of the terrorist attacks of Hamas against Israel and reaffirm our condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Argentina recognizes the right of Israel to act in legitimate defense, but the measures taken must respect international humanitarian law, in particular as it relates to the principles of distinction and proportionality in accordance with the Fourth Geneva Convention and its additional protocols. We reiterate our condemnation of the attacks against civilians, and we call for an end to attacks on civilian infrastructure in Gaza, in particular hospitals, schools, refugee reception centers, amongst others. We welcome the fact that last week it was possible to achieve an agreement for a truce. Argentina recognizes and is grateful for the mediation carried out by Qatar and the efforts of Egypt and the United States to achieve this. We welcome the fact that there has been a release of some hostages by Hamas, and we reiterate our call for this urgent and unconditional release of all hostages to continue, amongst them Argentinians who are still being held captive. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is now a disaster. We hope that from the beginning of this truce, the entry of humanitarian assistance will be normalized so that it can reach the population affected sustainably and urgently. We recognize the important work that is being done by humanitarian workers on the ground, both those that are part of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, as well as those belonging to other organizations that are fulfilling this task. In order to cooperate with the humanitarian efforts of the international community, Argentina, through the Argentine Agency for International Cooperation and Humanitarian Assistance, White Helmets, and in cooperation with the International Red Cross, have organized 2 humanitarian actions to help civilian Palestinians, together with 2 expert missions to cooperate on efforts with the Egyptian Red Crescent, and we would particularly like to thank the government of Egypt for all of the help that they provided us. Although today our attention is focused on the Gaza Strip, we cannot lose sight of the fact that violence has also increased in the West Bank. We are particularly concerned at the violent actions of Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians. My country reiterates that the Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, and particular in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, are contrary to international law. They hinder peace and they weaken the prospect for a two-state solution. The gravity of the conflict that has become worse since the 7th of October shows that the status quo is not sustainable, and that what we need is to urgently resume negotiations aimed at achieving peace in the Middle East. Under the current circumstances, not only should we focus our efforts on avoiding a greater destabilization within the region, but also we should focus on bringing about a revitalization of the peace process. In this regard, Argentina joins in all calls aimed at achieving a sustained ceasefire and permanent ceasefire. For my country, there is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it is only through a resumption of negotiations between the parties in accordance with international law, the relevant resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council, and the pre-existing agreements between the parties, that a just and lasting peace will be achievable. This peace must be founded on the recognition of the right of the State of Israel to live in peace with its neighbors within secure and internationally recognized borders, as well as the right of the Palestinian people to establish an independent state on the basis of the 1967 borders and in accordance with what the parties determine in the process of negotiations. The international community represented in this General Assembly of the United Nations must renew its compromise, its commitment to peace in the Middle East to the benefit of all peoples in the region. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.